Okay, let's begin. Good afternoon from Los Angeles. It's 1 p.m. here in California. Whoever is watching or listening online, welcome. This is a series of panels organized by the International Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles, about the impact and implications of COVID-19 on different regions of the world. My name is Kevan Harris. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology at UCLA, and I teach in the National Institute. I'm joined here by my colleague, Doug Waxman, who is a political scientist and the head of the Nazarian Center of Israeli Studies at UCLA. And we're joined by an illustrious panel to discuss the geopolitical implications of COVID-19 for the Middle East. This panel is sponsored by the Center for Near Eastern Studies, the Nazarian Center for Israeli Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern Development, the Berkeley Center for International Relations, and here at the UCLA International Institute. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're very excited for this conversation. There's going to be a Q&A, so if you're watching online, feel free to send questions to our moderators, and your question can possibly be delivered to one or all of the speakers in our Q&A section. Our three speakers today need a small introduction, but their accomplishments are illustrious. So I'm going to be brief in the introduction so we can get into the discussion for today. First, we have Ambassador Hesham Youssef, who is a career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt. He's held positions at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and currently he's Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We also are happy to welcome Dalia Dassa Kaye, who's director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy and a political scientist here in California at the RAND Corporation. And finally, Ehud Eiran, who is a senior lecturer of international relations at the University of Haifa, and he's currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. The order of the speakers, who we've asked to speak for about 10 minutes on the geopolitical implications of COVID-19 for the Middle East and broader region, are going to be Hesham Youssef, then Dalia Kaye, then Ehud Eiran. So Ambassador Youssef, if you'd like to begin, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join this panel. Thank you for the invitation. Let me start by saying that the pandemic resulted in global disruptions that have their reflections in the Middle East. I will try to draw a global picture in 12 points in Twitter format, then address the Middle East implication in that context. First, we witnessed a crisis in international cooperation, with countries prohibiting exports and using illegal measures, and in some cases, arm twisting to steal medical shipments. Second, there was a dismal performance by international and regional institutions. Until today, we do not have a global strategy, and we don't even have regional strategies to deal with the pandemic. Third, the crisis gave ammunition to those arguing for bringing supply chains home, an anti-globalization move, arguing for resilience at the expense of economic efficiency for national security purposes. Fourth, peacekeeping is facing a huge challenge, with global traveling coming to a halt, and of course we can't resolve conflicts through Zoom. Fifth, the global economy is devastated, and this may lead to social unrest and revolts. Six, I think because of movement constraints, our life would be significantly shaped in cyberspace. And it is yet to be seen what the young generation will think about that. They were forced to seclusion, and they may shape the new corona world in cyberspace, or perhaps have a contrarian appreciation for communal life. We'll see. Seventh, the future of mass protests will be in jeopardy. Eighth, I think people realize that government performance matters, because government mistakes cost lives, and plenty of lives. Ninth, I think there was also a dismal performance in crisis management, providing accurate information, countering misinformation, and even conspiracy theories, which were rampant. 10th, I think also the pandemic resulted in societal tensions, as those who stayed home were angry because they felt that those who are leaving their homes put them in danger, regardless of why they were leaving their homes. And then 11th, I think the pandemic provided an excuse for some governments to expand intrusive surveillance under the guise of tracing contacts of those who are infected. And finally, we thought that we had a pretty good command on science to relieve us of much of our suffering. And of course, we were definitely wrong. So the pandemic has shaken the foundations of our existence. And this is not a temporary interruption of the norm. I think we need to come to terms with a new world that is in the making. And if the pandemic had caused huge challenges in the most advanced countries, you can only imagine the kind of havoc it entailed on the Middle East that has been witnessing devastating conflicts, massive displacement, erosion of governance capacity, social cohesion, and so on. But if I come to the Middle East, I will address very briefly 4 points: conflict dynamics, healthcare systems, democracy and change, and the economic challenges. If we go to the conflict dynamics, there were those who were questioning when the pandemic started whether political efforts would be mobilized to resolve or at least stabilize some of the protracted conflicts. And I think it's obvious today that this did not happen and probably will not happen. It's interesting that, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinians were in a dilemma between the necessity of cooperation, which took place, but in order to save life, and the political realities of an annexation plan that was forcing them to move towards ending cooperation with Israel. In Yemen, we haven't seen any real progress on the ground. In Libya, we saw the situation even getting much worse, with the situation changing on the ground, with Sarraj taking back many areas from Haftar. In Syria, political process has its ups and downs, mostly downs, but no real progress. ISIS has increased attacks in Iraq and Syria. On the positive side, we have witnessed that Iraqi Prime Minister was chosen after a long delay, and there is marginally reduced Iranian activity in Iraq. We also have seen a reduction in escalation between the United States and Iran, although this will probably be revived soon when they start discussing in the Security Council the possible extension of an arms embargo. So the situation is rather difficult. But all these conflicts resulted in a humanitarian situation that has a staggering cost. In Syria, half the population was forcibly displaced, and we have the worst humanitarian situation in the world in Yemen, in addition to humanitarian catastrophes in many other places in the region. But the general sentiment in many of these conflict areas is that, well, we can die from the virus, but probably death will come first, either from the conflict, from hunger, or from other sicknesses as well. So they have also been suffering, but they have all kinds of problems, and they feel that the virus is not the biggest problem that they have. And of course, it's impossible to contemplate social distancing in huge, overcrowded, and insanitary refugee camps. Of course, humanitarian situations is extremely difficult in conflict zones in the best of times. Now add to that the coronavirus and disruptions in supplies, shipping interruptions, travel restrictions, decision-making delays, and so on. It made the situation very difficult for all those who are suffering in the region. On the positive side, we saw some Gulf countries providing assistance to Iran, a gesture to demonstrate political intent to use the crisis to ease regional tensions. We saw the UAE becoming the second largest aid donor in the world, and so on. But still, we have our problems cut out for us. And I think radicalization would be on the rise, and the conflict may become also more difficult in terms of how the conflicting parties will deal with all kinds of requirements pertaining to the pandemic. But the key point is that the developments, pertaining to conflict were driven by the conflict dynamics, and they were not influenced in any fundamental manner by the pandemic. If we go to the healthcare systems, I think also it is, as we have seen in the countries that have the most robust healthcare systems, they were suffering from all kinds of difficulties. So the Middle East, of course, had these difficulties multiplied. But it also reminded people in different places around the world, particularly in developing countries, that even if you are from the protected elite in society, you must worry about the health of those neglected populations, because at the end of the day, the overall health in society depends on the health of its poorest people. And if a second wave of infections is inevitable as economies open up, according to experts, and perhaps also a third wave may be coming by next fall, then many developing countries, including in the Middle East, are probably already late in preparing for this eventuality. If I go to democracy and change, and I think this is crucial for the future of the region, because the region has witnessed a first wave of revolutions in the last decade, and as a result of all kinds of demands coming from the people for all kinds of drivers. But then after that, as a result of the governments not responding, we saw a second wave that had Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, and so on. And the grievances haven't been addressed. And over and above, now it has become even more difficult with public health concerns added to the list of these public grievances. But in addition to the lockdown, governments in the region intensified efforts to control the mindset through punishing those who are spreading information about the pandemic that contradicts the messages coming from the government. And there is clear evidence that some countries are preventing protests using the excuse of the fear of the spread of the virus. And of course, some governments are using surveillance tools to track those infected, but all these technology tools can be abused to track protesters and opposition. And of course, state measures would be much more intrusive. So it is a problem in relation to how things would develop in relation to this issue. Governments, are struggling with the difficult challenges of suppressing the virus and reviving the economy. And it is recognized that the economic situation globally will suffer hugely from the pandemic. The IMF considers it a crisis like no other because of its depth and because the whole world is suffering. The World Bank expects that 500 million people will be added to those who are destitute. The World Food Program thinks that there are 265 million people that would be pushed to the brink of starvation. So the cost is huge. And in the Middle East, also, the Gulf countries have been suffering because of the price of oil. Countries depending on tourism like Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, and so on, have seen zero traffic. Of course, the Gulf also will have to send many workers home, so this will affect workers' remittances, but also there is an impact on trade, investment, travel industries, and so on. So it is problematic. And of course, the debates on reopening the economies are very difficult because it is very difficult to have reconciling approaches between politicians, physicians, and economists. So it is quite difficult. So in the meantime, also the millions of jobs over the Middle East will be lost as a result of the virus. Let me conclude by indicating that countries will be facing a choice in relation to both their internal policies and their external policies. And internally, they will either benefit from the crisis and deal with the shortcomings in a more democratic and rules-based approach, or they will move towards curtailing freedom of expression and pursue a path of authoritarianism. Externally, they have to take into account that the global system will be weakened and they will either adopt an inward isolationist policy or one based on genuine international cooperation. And they will ask the question, can we find global solutions to global problems, or are we going to take a different route? And I think in the Middle East, I hope that the pandemic will have convinced people by now that the main challenge is good governance, not whether you're Sunni or Shia, secular or Islamic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Excellent point. So I'd like to turn over to Dr. Kaye, and let's hear her remarks.
Okay, well, thank you so much to UCLA for hosting this. As often occurs in these types of panels, when you have such an excellent first speaker, I really feel like I have very little to add. Ambassador, I couldn't agree more, especially with your last sentiment about the need for good governance and leadership understanding a better way forward. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there today. What I'll do is I'll focus on what I think are my basic premise at this point, and I do want to caveat this by saying that we're very early into this crisis. When we're talking about geopolitical impacts, it will take years to really understand the full magnitude of such a transformational crisis as we're living in today. So I just want to preface my comments with that. But at this stage, I would say that short of governments collapsing, which is possible because this pandemic is coming at a time of already intense fragility across this region and governments across this region, my main thesis is that I think the pandemic is largely accelerating and exacerbating existing trend lines. So what I'll do is I'll outline a few of those key trend lines. There are many. I think I'll put Israel-Palestine on the side since Ehud's speaking after me, so I'll let you speak to that. I have thoughts on that, but we'll let you speak to that. And I'll focus on some of the other region-wide trends, which are largely negative, and I will be arguing this crisis is unfortunately only making them worse. And I'll just conclude with, I think, maybe a couple areas of openings or potential shifts in the geopolitical balance that may be resulting because of this pandemic. So starting with some of the key trends, and I'll start with US-Iran, which is the space I watch most closely. And here I might disagree a little bit with the ambassador. Unfortunately, I think that while there was hope, and this would have been theoretically a brilliant time for a political opening to de-escalate this crisis. There was a lot of talk about, given how hard hit Iran was, of course, they themselves botched their response to this, but the Iranian people are suffering considerably from this crisis. Iran was the epicenter outside of East Asia at the outset of this crisis. So there was talk about a humanitarian ceasefire, humanitarian gestures, ease the sanctions, let up on escalation, try to kind of reset, obviously not a rapprochement between the US and Iran, but at least a pause. We unfortunately, there's also the sense that because of the constraints on both sides at home with so many domestic pressures to deal with, that would also lower the temperature and the incentive to continue escalating. Unfortunately, though, I don't think this political opportunity has been seized. And I actually would argue that, putting rhetoric aside, although the rhetoric is still pretty strong on both sides, even if you look at actual developments on the ground over the last few months, we're actually seeing, in my view, a continued escalation of this crisis. We are just saw continued rocket attacks from Iranian-backed militia forces in Iraq in mid-March that killed 2 US personnel. We see Iran continuing to expand and push the limits on its nuclear program, following, of course, the US unilateral withdrawal from that agreement. We've seen cyber attacks on Israeli water facilities, a counter cyber attack from the Israelis, military satellite launch last month. The US, for its part, is threatening, even though it's not in the nuclear agreement anymore, this kind of convoluted argument that it's in the deal so it can snap back sanctions and continue the UN arms embargo. Just today, we saw the US announce that it will stop the waivers for international cooperation to stop the non-proliferation efforts occurring in Iran. I could go on and on, but to me, this is not an environment of de-escalation since early January, when the US and Iran engaged in the first direct military conflict in the very long and torturous relationship our two countries have. So I would make the argument, sadly, that not only is the escalation not over, but the pandemic may only incentivize both sides to double down on escalatory policies, even if the intent is not to have all-out war. And I've seen many analyses, very convincing analyses, that neither side wants war, they can't afford it domestically, et cetera, but yet actions on the ground are leading us down this path. You could argue, and there are some, we're continuing to see reporting of the debates in the Trump administration, but those who are pushing for continuation of maximum pressure, a more hawkish position, continually gaining the upper ground, despite the lack of strategic results from this policy. We are not seeing a better behaved Iran. We're not seeing a better nuclear deal, but yet the focus is on continued pressure. And I think there's a sense that, Iran may be facing this pandemic on top of protests we saw last fall, at top of the economic catastrophe the country's facing. And of course, the oil price plunge. There are some who can be emboldened and feel Iran is on the ropes. This is time for the knockout punch, either to bring them back to a better deal, or maybe it will lead to regime collapse. But there's a case to be made that the pandemic could lead to a confidence in the current strategy that will just encourage further escalatory actions. The Iranians, for their part, could be viewing the situation in a similar way, in the sense that they may feel, well, the US is more constrained now in terms of responding to our provocations, and that because there's US elections coming up, there's other priorities domestically, the US is facing this pandemic is hitting the US very hard, that the US is less likely, the Trump administration is less likely to want to retaliate in any significant way. So my concern in some is that the potential of both sides being overconfident could lead to continued escalation and even renewed conflict, even if both sides didn't intend it. So that's the strategic trend line, the first strategic trend line that will actually touch every corner of the region that I'm watching most closely, that I think this pandemic has actually made worse, potentially. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my assessment at this stage. The second trend line that I'm looking at, that I think many of us are looking at, is the growing influence of Russian and Chinese involvement in the region. I'm less focused on Russia. Russia's a more opportunistic actor, faces its own constraints in the region, but China has a long-term strategy in the Middle East. It's developing through the Belt and Road Initiative, extensive networks, largely economic investment, but it's a long-term plan to stay in this region. They are most dependent on the region in terms of oil. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I'm not in the camp that says yes or no, good or bad. We could use some burden sharing. It all depends what they do with that influence, but it is a trend line to watch. And what's interesting is that the Chinese have really capitalized on COVID and this pandemic to build even further relationships and deepen relationships with countries in the region. You saw early on a shipment of 250,000 masks to Iran, for example. In late April, China signed a deal with Saudi Arabia for the purchase of Chinese test kits and medical expertise. It's really an interesting PR coup, given how much China itself botched their response to the pandemic and try to hide it at the outset, but they kind of turned it around and now have presented themselves as the trusted global power that can handle this kind of public health crisis better, certainly, than the United States. So that's how they're presenting it. I don't know how long lasting that will be, but just looking at GDP and kind of hard numbers alone, China's in the region for the long haul. And I think this pandemic has done nothing to reverse it and most likely has accelerated it. The third trend line, which very much tracks with some of what the ambassador said, which is one of the most worrying trend lines in the region, which is the continuation of entrenched authoritarianism and repression. Again, this is unfortunately trend lines that have been ongoing, particularly brutal after the counter-revolutions from the Arab uprisings over this past decade. There's continued unrest across the region, societal divisions, inequity, corruption. It's not just about unemployment, although that's a huge pressure. I've seen some predictions that this pandemic, combined with these previous pressures, could lead countries like Jordan to face up to 70% unemployment, youth unemployment, huge pressures on these countries. It's not a coincidence that this is a region that is ripe for breeding grounds for extremist groups. Unfortunately, we saw with the rise of ISIS and concerns about that returning. So in this environment, unfortunately, we have authoritarian leaders in many places, and even in those in kind of partial or semi-partial democracies, you know, really kind of going to the traditional playbook. The ambassador, I think, spelled it out well, you know, using the crisis, the public health crisis, as the cover to crack down on legitimate political opposition. And that's a really worrying trend line, especially when they're resorting to these surveillance tactics that are, you know, are good tactics to have in a public health crisis in terms of tracing and so forth. But those tactics, combined with the strong role we're seeing in the military playing in many of these countries, particularly because of such weak state institutions, those could outlast this pandemic. And that's a very worrying trend line for anyone that would like to see, forget about the democracy word, but just for anyone who would like to see better governance and accountability in this region. Extremely, extremely concerning. The last one I will point to in terms of trend lines, again, the ambassador touched on it, which is the humanitarian catastrophes before the pandemic, largely man-made catastrophes caused by these horrific civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen in particular. And that has produced some of the most daunting humanitarian crises that we have seen. The region has the biggest displacement crisis since World War II globally. So far, and we shouldn't hold our breath. Right now, in countries that are most war-torn, Syria, Yemen, the numbers of COVID are relatively low. But the worst may be yet to come in the Middle East. And as the ambassador laid out, the region is completely unprepared to deal with public health crises of this magnitude in terms of health infrastructure, capability, and so forth. And the refugee issue and the displaced person issue is particularly concerning, given that refugees live in these crowded conditions, both within camps and these city areas or encampments, and are more likely to have pre-existing conditions because they didn't have previous access to adequate healthcare. So right now, it has not multiplied the already daunting crisis, but that I think is a huge concern, that COVID is going to only exacerbate those difficult conflict conditions. And unfortunately, I would agree with the ambassador that the underlying incentives to continue these conflicts are still in place, unfortunately, in many of these places. We can get more into that in Q&A. I want to just conclude with a couple, I don't know if I want to say bright spots, they may be short-lived, but areas where things may be shifting a little bit. And here I want to make it clear that it's not just because of the pandemic. I think a lot of this is also because we have a perfect storm of, and they're related, of course, but the pandemic, which with the oil crisis and the drastic drop in oil revenue and demand, that combined with this public health crisis could have transformational effects in this region. The one area where, the first area where I think it's a potential opening, and this is an area where I think this was happening anyway, even before the pandemic, is this potential for de-escalation between the Arab Gulf and Iran, between the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council states, and Iran. You already saw the United Arab Emirates, even before the pandemic, interested in talking, reaching out to the Iranians. They started to hold maritime security talks, not coincidentally after they started to have tankers and oil sites bombed, targeted by the Iranians over the summer, last summer, when the Iranians decided that they would exact a toll for the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy. And some of these of Iran's neighbors in the Arab Gulf kind of turned around and said, yeah, we like the idea of Iran being contained. We don't like Iran, but this is your escalation, US, your escalation with Iran is starting to literally hit home. And that's not okay, because we don't want an implosion in Iran on our border. This is not a strategic way to deal with the Iran problem. So they started to reach out on their own. And so we started to see some de-escalation there with the pandemic. I think the ambassador mentioned this, that we had shipment from the Emiratis to the Iranians. We even had high-level discussions that we have not seen between the Emiratis and the Iranians. So that's potentially good news. We've also seen de-escalation potential in Yemen. The Emirates were already signaling an interest in winding that war down. We've seen an interest in a ceasefire from the Saudis. COVID could potentially accelerate those trends in the sense that there's less capacity potentially to engage in these kinds of conflicts with this pandemic and oil crisis raging at home. The final, I think, shift, which is, I think, one of the more interesting spaces to watch and relates to the first de-escalation, but could have other impacts as well, which is the changing nature of the Arab Gulf. The oil crisis and the pandemic could potentially really change these societies for a long time, for at least the past decade, if not longer. These smaller Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the largest among them, but the smaller Gulf states really have been asserting their power in a way disproportionate to what you would expect, given their size and capacity. And so one could argue, or it's something to look at, whether their political clout will diminish as the expats leave their countries, as they're not able to host these broad international summits. So Emirates had to cancel the expo in this fall. They were expecting 25 million visitors. They're having a flight of their expat workers from South Asia. Some of this could be a very good thing because it can accelerate some of the diversification that they've been aiming for in terms of their own domestic reforms. So I'm not saying it's a particularly bad thing. We don't want people to lose jobs, of course, but it might not be such a bad thing to kind of recalibrate the weight of the Arab Gulf in the region. And if it does serve to restrain some of their more assertive activities we've seen in recent years in Libya and Yemen in particular, which have been really fueling extremely devastating wars, if they kind of turn and focus back home to some of these accountability issues we were discussing earlier, that could be a very good thing. So I think I'll just end on that more positive note, and I look forward to hearing from others. Thank you.
Thanks for the positivity at the end, and some interesting points about the so-called soft power of the Gulf, which you don't hear very often actually in these discussions. So let's turn it over to Dr. Eiran for his comments, and then we've already been getting some questions online. So feel free to, as you're watching, if anything comes to mind, send it in via our Q&A format, and Dub and I will kind of corral these and direct it back at the panel.
Hi, I want to thank UCLA for including me in this panel. It's great to be here. Dalia said it was hard to follow an excellent first presentation, so I guess I'm left with the saying that everything was said, but not everyone said it. So I'll try to, despite the challenge, try to offer some other perspectives. So I'll start by saying maybe in general terms, I agree completely with Dalia. This is too early, I think, to offer a serious analysis of where we're heading for a number of reasons. We know from other massive pandemics that were over in human history, like the Black Death in the 14th century, that some of the effects rolled over for decades. Reformation, which occurred 100 years later, some of its sources are founded in the pandemic. I think this is especially acute in the Middle East, as over 60% of the population is younger than 30. And so the generational effect on the people who will be challenged by this will unfold for many years. I think the second general observation is that we cannot talk about a general trend in the region. If you look at the data, even of the illness, it varies in different countries. Initially, it was the non-Arab actors that took the most hit. Iran at some point. Half the cases of the region at some point were at Iran, Turkey, Israel, and in terms of power relations, you could say the United States. So the same paradigm we saw in power projection, which was with a lot of non-Arab actors, replicated itself in the illness, at least at some point. And the last general comment is that this coincided with this massive crisis of oil. Dalia mentioned that, the oil war, but also the dramatic decline in demand, which will, of course, put extra pressure on the limited resources. I want to offer three, so having with all these qualifications, I think there are three perspectives I propose to look at the how this crisis will unfold. First of all, the old theme that Middle Eastern scholars and political scientists are looking at, that's the state, the Arab and the non-Arab state. It's an old tension between pan-Arabism and the state capacity. And so it's fascinating to look how the state as an apparatus survived this. It is, of course, a massive challenge to state capacity, but not perhaps in the traditional senses of coercion, power, and military, but rather on other aspects of statism, such as the ability to deliver public health, testing, and even accurate information. And so I think in a way, for scholars who study the region, or for any educated person who is looking at it, we are now offered a broader analytical tool to look at the role of the state. That, of course, occurs in a broader global context. The ambassador already introduced this. We are at a moment, I think, that globalization is going back, and the state as a social institution is strengthening. Production will be moving back, and so on. And so we have to review or analyze how the states are dealing with this challenge and how they're benefiting from this global environment. It's going to be more conducive, I think, for traditional state capacity. Within the state capacity discussion, Middle Eastern scholars look a lot at securitization, security forces, the combination of technological abilities and repressive regimes led to further measures to control, to offer social control, even in countries that are more democratic like Israel, in which suddenly it turns out internal security services are now following through their cell phones citizens and whoever they interacted with weeks earlier. And so in the short term, I think the state as an institution is obviously getting stronger. There's a rallying around the flag. It's the only institution that can maybe offer help. But in the long term, there are significant challenges. The economic crisis is going to affect the global economic crisis, the decline in demand for oil, and the pressures and resources needed for the healthcare will present more economic challenges. And of course, economic resources, a fundamental tool of the state to deal with these challenges. It does offer a potential, even in the long-term strengthening, if economy will further shudder. As we saw in many states, the solution is greater state involvement in the economy. I think two countries are interesting in particular, Lebanon and Iraq. We saw a civil society response towards the state with demonstrations, with new martyrs against the state. This was somewhat halted with the crisis, but it will be very interesting to see how it rolls. So one perspective is the state. The second perspective is the role of great powers. One lens we are traditionally using, at least in political science, to look at the region is the role of external powers. We're already in a process of an American withdrawal of sorts, especially under the current administration that's less committed to global leadership. But we do not still have another global competitor a la the Cold War. But I agree with Dalia, we are bound to see an American-Chinese competition. There were already early signs of that. China, as Dalia mentioned, was very eager to show it's dealing more effectively with the disease. And on the American incentive, there's a short-term political incentive for the current administration to paint China as the villain in the story. And we already saw American efforts, including a visit of Secretary Pompeo last week in Israel, to push the government to disengage from some infrastructure projects with China. So it's a funny moment in which one great power is in decline, the other one is not there yet. There's early signs of competition, which may be drastically affected by a new administration come the election for January 2021. I think one structural opportunity here is for regional actors to cooperate more. If the great powers are not as dominant, maybe the Sunni alliance, the Israeli-Sunni relationship will have an even greater opening. Although I should caution, as Dalia said, perhaps some of the Gulf states would prefer bandwagoning against Iran, i.e. joining Iran rather than confronting it. So we have the state, we have great powers, and I think the third lens is, of course, conflicts in the region. The short outlook, I think for a short time, the crisis froze some of the conflicts because of the resources that had to be allocated or the concern about the conflict. There was definitely an opportunity to cooperate. We saw countries providing some assistance. Even in our own small corner of Israel-Palestine, there was much greater cooperation, not directly even simply on health, but on secondary issues, like Israel in an unprecedented way allowed Palestinian laborers to remain in territorial Israel for the length of the crisis. We saw flights, the first ever flight of Etihad, a Gulf airline into Israel, and some flights from Israel to Sudan, which no one took responsibility for, but now we can see that something is happening. However, I have to join the pessimistic line. While it froze and while there were opportunities, conflicts are still rolling. There's a growing tension on the Iranian front, not only US-Iran, but also Israel-Iran, the dual cyber attacks, as well as signaling from Hezbollah that it may take a more active role. The last few weeks, it indicated, including on actions on the ground, that it's ready to be more aggressive to deal with Israeli attacks in Lebanon. For example, in a surprising incident, Hezbollah cut 3 places in the fence between Israel and Lebanon, indicating that if it wanted, it could go through the holes it created. And then there are already, so these are, I think, are the 3 lenses, state, great powers, conflict. There were 2 questions about Israel-Palestine. Would that be an appropriate moment to address them?
We'll come to the questions in a moment. So, but please, if you have some concluding remarks.
So I think the conclusion is, in the first few weeks of this shock, there was an opening for a shift, I think, in the consciousness. I actually thought it reminded me a bit of the last days of the first Gulf War, when suddenly American dominance in Iraq changed the minds of people in the Middle East. So there was an option for that, but I think the stronger trends that were highlighted in my colleagues' comments and in mine are stronger than this potential not fully used opportunity to change regional consciousness.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists, Ambassador Youssef, Dr. Dassa, Kaye, and Dr. Eiran. That was really fascinating overviews of the impact of this pandemic on the region. I think all 3 of you really made the necessary caveat that, of course, we're still in early days of seeing the impact of this pandemic. And in fact, its implications will continue to affect the region for many, many years to come. And so while this discussion that we're having today is just a very, very early and initial look at what will be what will continue to have a massive and long-term, potentially transformative impact upon the region. I think the other thing that all 3 of you agreed upon was the way in which the pandemic reinforces existing trends, exacerbates existing conflicts, rather than really fundamentally changing the trajectory of the region's politics and economics or humanitarian affairs. And in fact, it's worsened it. And so, unfortunately, what was already a fairly dire situation politically, economically, and in humanitarian terms across the region, in the region at large, has only been made worse by the pandemic. And as I think was pointed out, the worst may be yet to come. So this is something of a depressing conversation about the Middle East. But then again, many discussions about Middle East politics tend to be somewhat depressing. So I suppose that's the drawback of our business. Let me now, we've been receiving questions, and I want to encourage the audience out there who are joining us from all around the world to continue to send in these questions. And I will, along with Kevan, try to pose as many as we can to our panelists. I'll begin with just throwing out a couple of questions that have concerned, really focused on points that were raised, but maybe to get into a bit more detail on some of these points. So one of the questions that have come up has been concerning the effect that the precipitous decline in oil prices has had. You've mentioned that this is kind of compounded in a way the economic impact of the COVID-19 and the geostrategic impact of this. But perhaps you could you might want to elaborate. And in many ways, all three of you, I would say, for the Arab world, clearly, is it going to accelerate the desire and the attempt to diversify their economies away from being rentier economies based upon oil revenue? For Israel, on the other hand, high oil prices gave Israel an opportunity to export natural gas and to increase and to potentially gain great amount of wealth and more regional influence through its natural gas imports. Does the decline in oil prices, and this is particularly for Dr. Eiran, will that impact Israel's ability to export natural gas? And what does the declining oil prices mean for regional relations, particularly the relationship between, or the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran? So that's one question. The other series of questions that have come in, and I'm going to add to this a little bit, concern something that hasn't been mentioned as yet, but is looming on the political horizon, and that is Israel's potential annexation of parts of the West Bank. So the question here, and again, feel free, and any of you to respond to this, does the likely annexation of parts of the West Bank, maybe starting as early as July, maybe particularly for Ambassador Youssef, there's been a report in the Israeli pro-Netanyahu newspaper Israel Hayom today, which said that Jordan, the Saudis, the UAE and others will not oppose annexation, or they may do so publicly, but they're not really going to take any steps to really do anything about this. Does the impact of the pandemic make it more or less likely for Arab states to take strong actions in response to annexation of the West Bank? In other words, are they now in a weaker position, worried about their domestic populations, and therefore more responsive to public opinion and maybe more willing to take steps to counter annexation of the West Bank? Or are they more nervous and therefore less likely to do anything? Similarly, on the question of annexation, the Palestinian Authority has just, in response to the threat of annexation, the PLO has formally announced it's ending its agreements with Israel, in particular its security cooperation with Israel. Is that going to undermine the Palestinian Authority's ability to respond to the coronavirus pandemic? What is the connection between these agreements with Israel, cooperation with Israel, and the PA's ability to respond to the coronavirus pandemic? And finally, on the impact of annexation for terrorist organizations operating in the region, is it likely to increase their willingness to carry out attacks, both within the region and further afield in Western countries? So there's a lot of questions. Feel free to answer, whatever most interests you in those questions. Perhaps we'll start with Ambassador Youssef, and again, we'll work around the three panelists in the same order.
Thank you very much. Let me try to respond to the question in relation to annexation. I think this issue is a make or break in relation to how the possibility of establishing a two-state solution. And there are many who believe that this would be the last nail in the coffin of the two-state solution. So this is why the response in relation to this issue will be huge. Of course, different Arab countries are dealing with this issue in different ways. The Palestinians have announced that they would stop coordination and so on. And Jordan, the king of Jordan, indicated very clearly that this will put Israel and Jordan on a confrontation path. Because Jordan would be the one that would be most affected by this development because of the annexation of the Jordan Valley in particular, but because of the situation in relation to the two-state solution. And I think the message has reached Israel quite clearly that this will have a huge impact. But unfortunately, Israel is dealing with this issue in accordance to its internal situation and the situation regarding the Prime Minister Netanyahu and how he's going to deal with his child and so on. So will it result in more extremism? Absolutely, because the argument that those who have been advocating for peace for the last 20 something years have been saying, no, we will reach the two-state solution, we will achieve peace, and so on. So now even those who have been advocating for peace for decades are saying we failed and we don't have a solution. So it will become difficult. So this gives, of course, ammunition for all those who are arguing for using violence, using that peace didn't work. So we will see how things develop. Jordan also is saying that this is a violation of the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, because Israel and Jordan, when they had their agreement, the borders were not delineated between the West Bank and Jordan. Now, if Israel annexes this land and considers it part of its land, Jordan will never delineate borders between the West Bank and Jordan. So we will see escalation. Of course, at the same time, there are countries in the region that do not want to anger the United States at this point in time, and they are waiting to see what the outcome of the elections would be and so on. So this will be a situation where I expect escalation for the few weeks and months to come.
Dalia, yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with annexation, just to follow up on that. I think that the pandemic is probably less of a factor than the U.S. factor and the enabling environment that the U.S. has created through the Trump plan, which it could be read as an annexation plan of sorts itself. So what's interesting is that to the extent that we're going to see any constraints on Netanyahu for annexation, I would think they would come from within Israel itself, particularly its defense establishment. We've had seeing just this week major figures in Israel, Ehud, I'm sure will elaborate, because of the Jordan factor and other national security considerations, vehemently arguing against annexation as a real threat to Israel's security. But I think the dilemma with the broader Arab world is that, and this is one of those arguments of, these were trends that were there before the pandemic. Unfortunately, the Palestinian conflict is not really on the radar in the region anymore. When you have civil wars of the magnitude of Syria and Yemen and even Libya, the Palestinian conflict is not looking like the front and center burning issue. Now, of course, emotionally, it still resonates in the region among Arab publics, of course, but these Gulf leaders have made it very clear they've charted a different direction, and they're not really paying a cost for it. Again, they have this quite enabling environment. The dilemma, though, of course, is that Israel could make peace with these Arab states. The problem is it's not really at war with the Arab world anymore. It's been a long time since Israel has faced a real threat from any surrounding Arab states. Actually, relations with Egypt are closer than ever. The Gulf state normalization phenomenon has been ongoing. It's no big surprise, even though every day it seems to be a new headline acting as if this is some big, a momentous event. It's really not big news. So it's not earth-shattering for Israel even to make peace with. It's certainly important symbolically to Israelis. They want to be accepted in the region, but it's not earth-shattering because Israel isn't at war with Saudi Arabia. It's at war with Hezbollah. It's at war with Iran. These are the conflicts that need to be solved. And ultimately, the Palestinians and Israelis live on one piece of land. So they can make all the peace they want with the Arab world, but ultimately that's not going to resolve the conflict that's right next door. And within their country, especially if they annex. So I agree with the ambassador. I think the trajectory is not looking good. The two-state solution wasn't looking very viable before the pandemic. And with Netanyahu capitalizing on the pandemic in the election, consolidating this coalition that was probably unthinkable before that Benny Gantz would succumb to the conditions he did, really is making the two-state solution looking like it's hanging on a thread more than it ever has been. And just briefly on the oil decline, I think I alluded to already, it's going to have an impact across the region, again, combined with the pandemic, not just in the oil-rich states, but all those surrounding states in Jordan and Egypt and other economies where workers rely on the remittances they get from the oil Gulf economies. But what I think is a really, really interesting space to watch, as I said, is the social and political impact it will have within the Gulf states themselves. This rentier state model already wasn't looking sustainable. They were already trying to diversify economies because they knew they couldn't buy off, domestic discontent forever. But now it's really now it's an existential crisis, and they're going to have a different relationship with their population to survive, frankly. So I think that is going to be potentially not just an economic impact, but a political impact of what these states look like in the months and years to come. On Saudi Iran, I think that there's other factors that are kind of more at play in terms of whether things ramp up or down. Unfortunately, hopes that maybe the oil price plunge with the pandemic would lead, let's say, the Saudis to purchase less arms. They were the 5th largest arms purchaser in the world. I think they purchased over 60 billion just last year. So there could be hopes that scaling back on arms purchases in the face of these other pressures would maybe lead to this more de-escalation with Iran, and the Iranians face similar constraints. The problem is these regional wars are not that costly to fuel if there's a desire to do so. So I think the real question is political will. Where do these leaders in this region want to take their countries and their people?
Thank you. Dr. Eiran.
Let me add to the annexation one angle which I think goes beyond simply Israel-Palestine. That's the role of the EU. Seen from the region, the EU is an important actor in moderating conflicts, moderating Israeli actions in the West Bank, supporting civil society, particularly in North Africa. And I think one side effect of the crisis is a weakening of the European Union and consequently its ability to serve as a moderating power. Over half of Israel's exports goes to the EU. And if there was a stronger EU that took a stronger position, calculations in Jerusalem would have been different. And this weakness, I'm afraid, is not limited only to moderating this conflict, but other aspects of the region. Maybe looking from North America, we don't think about it that much, but in some corners, what the Europeans are doing is quite significant. I think the decision about the annexation specifically will be some internal negotiation, as Dalia mentioned, between the security establishment, the prime minister who feels confident and desperate because of the trial. And in this discussion, the Arab position will play an important role for the security establishment. It's important to note that contrary to previous debates, like the one we had between the security establishment and Prime Minister Netanyahu over Iran, we have a stronger set, weaker set of military and security leaders. The head of the Mossad is very close to Netanyahu and probably won't challenge him. And so I'm not sure how much we can count on this as a moderating element. Another potential unexpected development is Israel hates to be in a situation it deals with two fronts. If there's further escalation with Hezbollah in Iran, this may provide some freezing element to this intention to annex. The second issue was what happens if Israel and the Palestinian Authority stop cooperating, and how would that affect humanitarian effects? I'll say a few things. I think, first of all, the PA is pretty much dependent on Israel as an institution, not only directly in health issues, but economics, access to labor, and so on. I should also note that Abu Mazen said this a number of times about ending agreements, and I think we have to wait and see. The statement he made recently is not enough. A third component is that the Israelis who are engaged in the West Bank, and I should also say Gaza, in the security establishment, think about it already in humanitarian terms. So there is a constant awareness that this is not only a conflictual political situation, but a situation that can end up as a humanitarian challenge directly to Israel. If the PA collapses and there's a humanitarian disaster, Israel will have to fend for it. It's maybe symbolic that the commanding officer of Home Command, who dealt with the military's response to Corona in Israel, is going to be very soon the commanding officer of Central Command, which is the command responsible for the West Bank. So the same general that dealt with Corona in Israel is now going to be responsible for the West Bank. It's very moderate and smart general. So as much as we can pin our hopes on individuals, there's at least some hope there. The third question that Dov raised was about energy. It should be noted that Israeli efforts to export energy to Europe, especially, were already, although there were many statements, it faces significant difficulties for example, it requires a massive pipeline, and we were not close to major exports. It will weaken Israel's potential leverage on Egypt and Jordan, two countries it does export some gas to. And it will weaken early mechanisms of energy cooperation, especially the Egyptian-led Mediterranean Forum for Gas, which was an early sign of an institutional regional arrangement around energy. Once energy becomes less important, or gas becomes less important, there'll be less incentive to develop this cooperation mechanism. And again, a non-coronavirus development is the most important. That's Turkey's assertiveness in the Eastern Mediterranean and the challenges it posed to energy delivery and development, especially around Cyprus.
Well, thank you for those for that really interesting answers. We've got some more questions coming in, and I'm conscious of the fact that we don't have a great amount of time. So I'm going to just again pose a broad question that has come in different ways to all three of you, and then we'll see how much time we have left. And that's we so far the picture that you painted, and I think it's an accurate picture, as being a pretty bleak one. I think we could all say that. Are there any examples of cooperation occurring that we can see that brought in response to this pandemic, whether it's cooperation at the interstate level, where there was mention made of greater cooperation within the GCC, for example, but also cooperation societally, maybe between different sectors of these domestic societies? Are we seeing actors come together? I mean, some of these countries have long been driven by internal divides, sectarian divides. For example, Lebanon is one that comes obviously to mind. Is the impact of this crisis resulting or leading to some surprising amounts of cooperation or unity where there was previously division and discord? And this, again, feel free to bring in any specific country. We haven't talked to Ambassador Youssef here. You're obviously from Egypt, so I'm wondering, what we're seeing. How is this impacting Egypt, both domestically, but also Egypt's cooperation, for example, with Sudan or with Israel or with its neighbors?
Well, unfortunately, what we have seen globally is that the response to the pandemic was national and not international. And what we have seen also globally, that countries were competing for all kinds of medical equipment, even masks and so on. So this was the global attitude because of the shortage of medical supply and so on. So it wasn't, there was little areas for cooperation. But having said that, I also gave a number of examples where there was cooperation, including Gulf assistance to Iran, Israeli-Palestinian cooperation, and so on. So there were some bright spots. But the problem is that these bright spots are not enough to make the necessary requirement for a transformation, for a new beginning, for, I think Dalia was talking about some of the positive elements in relation to, the silver lining that we may see that may have a positive, outcome and so on. And I agree with that. But the problem that is this positive dimension in relation to the big picture that you refer to, and I think the three of us refer to, is rather minimal. So yes, there has been cooperation. And I think cooperation will probably increase as the severity of the pandemic declines. But I don't think that we can be optimistic and see light at the end of the tunnel in relation to a number of elements pertaining to the situation in the region as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you, Dalia.
Yeah, not much to add. I agree. I think that the two examples I thought of were already mentioned. I think I even mentioned them myself as well. The UAE shipment to Iran, the dialogue there that we had not seen. Again, I think most of this so far is tactical, not strategic, and that's what I think the ambassador is referring to. It's just not clear this can lead to a long-term shift. The PA Israeli cooperation was interesting. Just Israel loaned $200 million to the PA to make up for tax revenue it lost in the virus. All well and good. You're seeing, stories of Gaza garment makers shipping masks and protective gear to Israel. Instead of graffiti being anti-Israel on the walls, you're seeing, COVID-19 graffiti. I mean, that's, I guess progress. The problem is it only goes so far when you're dealing with the specter of Israel potentially annexing the West Bank, nearly the entire West Bank and the Jordan Valley, which will completely demolish any potential openings that might have existed. So I think that's the problem we're facing, is that they're interesting tactical shifts, but we're not seeing a change in the strategic directory. One last point we didn't raise that I would just bring in here is, and this does take political will, not just from the region, but from outside, working with the region, and probably won't be coming from the US right now, but it could, and along with other international partners. You're seeing a lot more talk in security conferences and other venues of the need to establish a regional dialogue, security dialogue. And, a pandemic couldn't make more clear that the crises in the region cross geographic boundaries. Nobody wins in a pandemic. Nobody wins from maritime security being undermined through constant attacks against tankers. Everybody loses. And so there is a need, I've been arguing this for many years, of the Egyptians actually and historically have been in the forefront of efforts to be interested in forging a regional dialogue. We need to figure out a model. It will take time, but there needs to be an investment in some kind of form for all regional states, and it needs to be inclusive. It can't just be a forum to counter Iran or a forum to solve the Israel-Palestinian conflict. That's how they've been done in the past. They didn't work, but we need some kind of forum. The Middle East is the least institutionalized region of the world. It's the only region that doesn't have some open dialogue of this nature. It's really time. So my hope is that this pandemic can be used as an opening to hopefully increase the appetite for that within the region. We don't see it yet, but maybe we'll get there.
Yes, Dr.
Eiran. I think, as my two colleagues mentioned, we did see some signs of cooperation, highlighting again that there's some areas, as Dalia mentioned, that are easier to cooperate rather than others. Internally, I can say a few words about Israel. The healthcare field is one of the only areas that are completely integrated in Israeli society. While schooling is separate, for example, hospitals are generally completely joined, and there's a disproportionate number of Israeli Arabs, Israeli Palestinians working in that sector. So I think in that respect, it did create an atmosphere of goodwill and acceptance. Again, there's already a trajectory in this direction when Israeli Arabs are more integrated in some of the public spheres. For example, the chairman of Israel's second biggest bank that was initially created by the Zionist movement, Bank Leumi, is now in Israeli Palestinians. We also saw reaching across another divide, the internal Jewish divide between ultra-Orthodox and secular. Bnei Brak, a Haredi city, was the most severely hit in terms of geography, and the IDF took it over. So these are two populations that don't mix. As you know, ultra-Orthodox don't serve, and yet the military as an institution was able to reach out. There were openings for gestures. Kfar Qasim, I think, a big Palestinian city, assisted Bnei Brak. And so these things, again, they take time. And I think these gestures, at least on the internal arena, do make a difference on the long term. And they do remind, and excuse me for being naive, they do remind our common humanity in these issues. I think it's not the last chapter, and there are two big developments that can change that, and that is the development of a vaccine or some technological breakthrough that will make testing much easier. So that depends who will be the first one to do it, but there's a lot of efforts in Israel to develop cheaper and quicker solutions for that. If this is somehow leveraged to a broader outreach, or perhaps a new American administration with a new a polio type vaccine that is offered to the world can change this grim picture we are painting now of very limited cooperation.
Let me ask one final question for our panelists. I think the discussion has been excellent so far, and I want to try to link the discussion of the need to rethink the economic models in the region, coupled with the ongoing and, in my opinion, temporarily suspended social unrest. We know historically that in times of emergency, whether in the region or even in the United States, when there's war or emergency, public contention goes down. Many people expect it will never pop up again, but when the emergency is ended, normalcy does not appear. Instead, you usually see a rise in claims on political elites, new demands, possibly even new coalitions that were born during the emergency period. So, it's probably not a crazy idea to predict that either through the introduction of new forms of treatment, which at least make it easier to deal with the illness, or in this miracle vaccine, whenever it comes, that when the post normal phase is introduced, a rise of different types of protests will occur, making both old and new demands. How will that be? Might that intersect with the need recognized both by those in charge as well as many others for a new economic model, not one for the region, but country specific, given the decline in commodity prices, the lack of investment from Western investors, and the possibility but not promise of funds coming from the East to kind of reintegrate some parts of the region into the world economy. Is there a model that can satisfy, not everyone, of course, but that we can rethink the region and the incorporation of so many individuals who have been demanding to be pulled into both social and economic contexts over the last decade? So what as individual countries, how could they think of reinserting themselves in the world economy, whether or not the geopolitics aside for the time being? Ambassador Youssef, please.
Well, I think this is a crucial issue, because I think the impact on the economies in the region will be catastrophic. And it applies across the board. Even those who have huge investments and funds in the Gulf are suffering hugely from what is happening. Of course, the decline in the price of oil has had a huge impact. And I just saw a report this morning that expects that 2.5 million people will have to leave the Gulf as a result of COVID-19. So this will happen. So the decline will happen. At the same time, I think a number of countries in the Gulf have been talking about diversification of the economy for years, but they haven't been as serious about it as they could. So I think that what happened in the pandemic will result in a rethinking of the economies in the Gulf in a much more fundamental way, because they also realized that all these workers, just like they were helping in building the economy, they can become also a source of danger as a result of the virus. So this is part of it. But then there are a number of other countries in that will be dealing with all kinds of things. We were discussing earlier the price of oil, for example, and how this would be a problem for the Gulf. But this is absolutely welcome to a country like Jordan, a country like Morocco that imports a large portion of its oil. So this will have a positive impact on their process of development. But then we come to another dimension, issues pertaining to, okay, how long will it take to recover? And this is something that would be very difficult to calculate or to predict in major sectors. So in a sector like tourism, for example, when will Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, Morocco be able to recover some of the tourists and so on? No one knows. If we are not clear on when we will have planes flying in the air in the next few months. So, and also people will start thinking about tourism in a totally different way. They will start thinking, okay, do I want to be held in this place if there is a second wave or a third wave and so on? Investments in light of the current situation regarding investments and people going to much safer havens in relation to investment and so on. So countries will be forced to rethink their strategy across the board. Whether they are rich countries, poorer countries, middle income countries, they will have to do that. The problem is that the whole world is passing through this crisis at the same time. So when we had the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we still had China and India that were able to pull the global economy. We don't have anything like that this time. So now it is much more difficult, and countries will have to work on it very hard. Otherwise, there will be another wave of revolutions, revolts, demonstrations, you name it, because people will be suffering a lot, and as a result of poverty, loss of employment, and so on.
Dr. Dassa.
Yeah, I really can't add more. That was so thorough. Only to say that I think we absolutely can and should expect new waves. The original conditions that led to the protest across the region, and they do vary. I think that's an important point, but the grievances are, there are some commonalities. I think that now there'll be, the pandemic lays bare the real weaknesses of these societies, these governments, and their state capacities to handle people's needs, and really underscores the inequities, even in Gulf oil-rich countries. And so I think, but certainly in countries like Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon is in particularly dire condition. So I think we can expect protest and pressures. The question is, what will the response be? When we saw the initial wave of protest in the Arab uprisings, there are two tactics: repression or co-option. And in the past, the oil-rich states could co-opt. They could afford to co-opt. That option is likely off the agenda now. I think the age of the rentier state, indefinite age of the is done. So is it going to just be a playbook of doubling down on repressive tactics and squashing any opposition, or is there going to be openings or new contracts between state and society of maybe, you're willing to put up with a certain level of political repression if you're opening up the societal space? That looks like what Saudi Arabia is right now aiming for. Hard to know if that's going to be a bargain that's sustainable, but it will mean that people live very differently, even in these states that were well subsidized in the past. Those cuts will be there. People will get taxed who have not been taxed before. They will not be able to live the kinds of lives they led before. The oil money will not be flowing to the rest of the region. So I think it's a very, very important question, but one of those that I think we're going to have to watch for a while to really understand how it's going to play out.
Dr. Eiran, final word for you.
Yes, thank you. It will be a strange moment to try and integrate to the global economy, as we are witnessing a reversal of globalization and perhaps going back to state-centered economic models. It will create, I think, an opening for China to invest in economically challenged areas, as we've seen their investments in Africa, which will lead to more discussions about Chinese control of infrastructure. Diversification is difficult because part of it, at least in Saudi Arabia, required massive investments, like this new city NEOM or moving to high-tech. And if the cost of oil is dropping so much, it will be difficult for MBS to try and pursue these initiatives. If I'm trying to think outside of the box, what are the opportunities? Healthcare is going to be a huge industry in the wealthier parts of the world. It's very expensive in places like North America. And the ability to deliver telemedicine will offer opportunities for countries that have good training in their medical sector to provide to richer countries via technology like the one we're using now. Healthcare also requires a lot of laborers that have limited skills, like support staff and so on, which may create some demand for less skilled public. But include, for example, some of the Middle Eastern immigrants in Europe can find themselves in these sectors. But that will require innovation, thinking outside of the box, reconnecting to some global networks of healthcare. And I think the picture we described here is not very promising about it, but the opportunity, I think, is there.
Well, thank you all. If you've been watching, I want you to know that you were not alone. Our live audience just on Zoom alone was in the triple digits, many more on YouTube. So arguably a more successful panel than even could be held in person in some cases at UCLA. On behalf of UCLA and the National Institute, I'd like to thank everyone for participating and watching. And my thanks to Doug Waxman for co-moderating this panel. And I hope that we're able to continue this conversation in this forum or other fora in the future, because as all of us have established, this is the beginning of this process. And I think keeping an eye on it and keeping these conversations going is very important. Thanks so much. And we appreciate you watching and participating.